Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we're going to paint this hyacinth in a pretty glass bottle, and I'll have the real-time version of this tutorial up in Critique Club. Actually, it's up right now if you're a member and you want to check it out. I'll put a link in the video description so you can find it. I'm using Golden Open Acrylics, and I've been curious about these paints for a while, and I purchased a small set of the modern colors last fall, and I'm finally getting around to using them, and this is the second time that I've used them. The first time I used them, I used just the colors in the set, which are a bright yellow, a pyrrole red, a magenta, a phthalo blue, a phthalo green, and a white, so very bright transparent colors except for the white. So I figured to save myself some mixing, I would see how these worked with some traditional acrylics. And so I'm using a ultramarine blue by Liquitex and a burnt sienna by M. Graham, and they mixed really well. And what happens when you mix some of the open acrylics, which act kind of like oil paints, they stay wetter a lot longer. When you mix that in with some traditional acrylics, it just makes the traditional acrylics stay wetter a little bit longer, but not as long as the open acrylics on their own. It's kind of like however much you cut it with the open acrylics, that's how slower it's going to dry. They kind of share the properties. So if you mix half and half, you would have paint that stayed wet half as long as the open acrylics would on their own. Now the open acrylics, those dabs of paint on my palette would stay wet overnight. That's how long they will stay wet. I think that's really incredible because during my painting session, I didn't have any issues with any skimming on any of the open acrylics. So I decided I would go ahead and get my edges of this canvas painted while I was at it, because that way I won't have to try to go in and match later, and I had plenty left, and nothing dried on me as I was blending this. And I let the background dry for an hour, and I came back and there was, on areas where it was a little bit lighter, I had more of the white open acrylic in there, it was a little bit tacky. So even after an hour, it wasn't completely dry. Now the thing you want to keep aware of with the open acrylics is that if you drop water on your canvas, it doesn't, like, the paint does not set. It doesn't cure as quickly as regular acrylics. So if I was to drop water on my canvas and then blot it up, I might lift up the paint underneath. So it's just something to keep in mind if you're using these paints and you're not used to them. So I'm sketching in the, there's kind of like a burlap napkin on the table, and I'm just kind of sketching that in. I'm using mostly white with just a little bit of the burnt sienna and ultramarine blue to kind of stain it a little bit so it's not just like glaring white. And I'm just kind of base coating that in. It is, I definitely feel like this gives me the liberty with this paint to get it just the way I want it, and I don't feel like I'm racing the clock. Generally, when I'm working with acrylics, I'll paint a little bit thicker and I'll paint as fast as I can so I can get the blending ability, but I don't feel like I have to do that here. And I did compare the using the regular acrylics with a slow drying gel versus using the open acrylics, and the open acrylics still stay wetter longer than conventional acrylics with a slow dry gel. But I wanted to see how they did work together. I was able to use all of those paints with each other, but I just was curious as to see how unique the open acrylics are. My next experience with the experiment with the open acrylics will be using them with the Aquila paint that I have from Japan, because that's what they reminded me so much of, and I'm really happy about that because I really like that paint, but it was very difficult to get in the United States without custom ordering, special ordering it from Japan, because they didn't sell it on Amazon anymore. They did at one time, and I didn't want to recommend a product that was going to be very difficult or expensive for viewers to get. But this, I think, is a wonderful alternative for someone who likes painting with oils but doesn't like the dry time, or who likes to paint with acrylics and they wish they could have a little bit more open working time. It still has some of the properties, like I find the look of it still has kind of that acrylic look to the painting, which is almost like you know, super bright and a little plasticky, but I'm really happy with these. I would definitely see myself picking up a tube of like ultramarine, yellow ochre, a larger tube of white, and probably a burnt sienna or a burnt umber. I think that the colors are, I was looking at the prices on getting like the tubes in this kit were 22 milliliters, and I'll link to these in the video description so you can find the kit that I used as well as larger tubes. And then like a 2-ounce tube, which is 3 times bigger than these little tubes, start off at around, you know, $8. So, I mean, it's about the same price as any artist grade paint. That's like, you know, on a site like Jerry's Autorama or Blick or one of the big box online sites, you're going to pay more if you walk into an art store, but not any more than you would for a regular tube of acrylics, I don't think. So what I'm doing here, working on the bottle, I'm putting in some of the colors that I see. I'm getting the some of the stem. I'm getting some shadows from the background and from the napkin. I'm getting little bursts of pink from the flowers I'm going to paint. And I'm just trying to get enough of the background color in there so that when I go in later, and I put my bright highlights on there, I'm going to have a little contrast. So I like to integrate this all at once because I feel like it just looks a lot more natural that way. And the reason I'm picking up my canvas and turning it every which way is because I have a tendency to have crooked bottles if I don't do this. And by flipping it upside down, it just gives me a new way to look at the picture as I'm going, so I don't end up with something leaning. I can kind of see it a lot better when I look at it upside down. So now I'm taking some green. I'm just drawing you can see the little spot of white there. That's where I dropped some water from my paintbrush, and I didn't notice it right away, and when I blotted it, it went right back to the white canvas. And this is probably 2 hours after or at least an hour and a half after I put that background in. So that's just one thing you want to be aware of when you're trying these open acrylics, so that you don't you know, because if it was regular acrylics, that would have been cured enough that I could just blot that off and no, it wouldn't bother anything. I think these take probably a couple of weeks to fully cure, so you could, you know, essentially lift that paint back up. Now, I haven't had any paints. I've just started playing with these this week, so I'm not an expert, obviously. I'm not an acrylic painter generally anyway, so I would never claim to be an expert on acrylics in any event, but I'm just kind of sharing some observations. After I've gotten a few paintings under my belt, I'm going to review this from the perspective of someone who mainly paints with watercolors, occasionally paints with oils, and usually doesn't enjoy painting with acrylics. So it'll be a different sort of review, but it will definitely give a perspective for other painters that are kind of in my situation. So I'm just throwing in some individual blossoms from this sprig of hyacinth. And generally when you have a multi-headed flower like this, you would paint a few flowers fairly deliberately, and then you would fill in with this kind of slips and slaps of paint here and there to give you that volume. And generally when you have, when you are looking at a multi-headed flower, the flowers closer to you are going to be a little sharper and more detailed and in focus, and everything else is just kind of be a little softer focused and just kind of give you the volume, or the give you the feeling of the volume. You know, there's all these different blooms there, but the only ones you really pick out and can see are the ones in the foreground. And you can do this over the course of a couple days if you wanted to just kind of slap in some color to represent the flower head as a whole, and then after it's dry, come back in with highlight colors and shadow colors and detail a few flowers. You totally could do that. And you can do a mix. You know, you could do kind of a rough draft and then go in and finalize a few flowers and do it that way. Everybody has their own process. My recommendation is work however suits you best, but I do recommend working on the whole painting at once. I don't recommend detailing one little bit and then working your way across the canvas. I feel like working it all at once is the best way to go, because you'll spot if something's off. Now, this was bothering me. These two little leaves I was putting in there looked like bunny ears to me, and all I could see was bunny ears, and it was driving me nuts. And honestly, I probably could have left it. If I left it alone and came back an hour later, I probably would have been fine with it, but it was just really bothering me in the moment. I'm like, I've got to, so then I started making them longer and highlighting, and that made it worse. And I added a leaf on the other side, and I was like, oh, it looks like two arms going, yay! And it was really bugging me. So I was kind of wondering what I was going to do to fix that, because it was just really annoying me. So as I'm like working on the glass here, all I'm thinking about is those bunny ear leaves and what I'm going to do about it. So I decided that I would see if I can scrub it out and work and repaint the background in. So here I just went in with clean water, I scrubbed over those, and look, I'm back to the white of the canvas. So that's what I mean about that paint not curing right away. So I mixed up, luckily that was just a 3-color mix. That was ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and white. So it was pretty easy for me to get back in there and mix it, since it was only 3 colors. I did have to adjust the temperature of it by adding more blue, because I had it a little too brown. It looked kind of dingy, but I eventually got a pretty good match. I noticed it doesn't seem like there's as much shift from wet to dry with these paints as I have noticed with other acrylics, so that's a good thing. I typically use a bunch of different acrylics. I say I'm probably I've used probably Liquitex heavy body acrylics more than other brands, but I have used, you know, other brands. But I do notice, like, it does seem like there's a little bit more of a shift with other brands. So this one seems to stay pretty true to its color. So when I was going in and trying to mix a color wet to match a color that was already dry, it wasn't that difficult. So here at this stage, what I'm doing is I am adding some shadows around the vase, and I think this is the next day because I sometimes like to let it sit and come back with fresh eyes. And I noticed that it felt like the napkin there that it was sitting on was kind of like fluttery or floating, and I didn't feel like the jar was weighing it down enough. I didn't feel like there was enough substance for the weight of that jar with water and flour, so I really wanted to increase some shadows. And I'll link a reference photo. If I forget, please let me know. I will link a reference photo down below so you can see what I was going by. There wasn't really strong contrast in the photo, but I really liked the premise. I liked that flower, so I just kind of added some more shadows and some more contrast in my photo. And here I decided to go with just a little leaf there on the side, so it was a kind of a different shape than the other one, so we wouldn't be tended to wanting to match them up. And I like that a lot better. So, you know, totally feel free to change your reference photo. I kind of wish I had turned the bottle a little bit so I had like the point of that squared off bottle facing the viewer instead of just being squared on like that. I think that would have been a little more interesting, but I didn't realize it until I was on this stage and I was putting the shadows in it. That would have been fun. Now, using a small round or liner brush, you can go in and go get those threads. I had to paint over some of those threads when I was adding the shadow in. You just go over that with a liner brush with the kind of inky paint that's kind of mixed down to like a half and half creamer consistency, and then you can go and paint those little threads. I put the threads longer on the right side, right edge of the fabric, and shorter on the left edge because whenever you have burlap or anything, it always seems to fray more in one direction than the other. It's just something I observed, and I really thought that would add a little realism to this piece here. I really had a lot of fun painting this. When I'm playing with a different type of medium than I usually use, or a different brand of paint, to try to remove some of the variables, I'll choose something fairly simple, because I find that once I really get into a painting and I'm using a new medium, it becomes definitely complex enough. I don't get bored, in other words. So that's why I chose such a simple painting for this, but I really enjoyed painting it. I like how it came out, and I encourage you to try these paints if you want a slower drying acrylic. For signing my name, I decided I would go with a paint pen just because I have a hard time with the brush. I seem to always mess it up, and I was afraid if I had to scrub out my signature and try again, I would lift up the background. So there's a little tip for you there. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you would like some more training on this, you want to see the real-time version, check out Critique Club. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, happy crafting!